Well, now we're going to look at various different frontiers, various different areas of U.S. westward expansion. And we're going to start with the West Coast, the frontier of California, as well as Oregon Territory, which, Oregon and Washington became states eventually. Now, by the way, earlier on, at the near the beginning of this course, we took sort of a tour of the different Native American regions and talked about them a little bit. And so you hopefully you recall something about the Pacific Northwest tribes. Looking at the area I have circled here, actually, that Pacific Northwest culture sort of extended down into northern California. Those boundaries between California and Oregon Territory were imaginary lines drawn by some white people that just happened to intersect a cultural region. So bear that in mind. A lot of the stuff that's true of the tribes in Oregon and Washington is true of the tribes in the very northernmost part of California as well. So some of the things that we talked about before, the fact that those Pacific Northwestern tribes had totem poles, which essentially told the whole history of the family outside whose home you would find one of these. Those societies were very hierarchical compared to other Native American societies. They were more complex. There was, there were social class issues which did not exist in most native cultures, and that's because the area was so rich in resources. So rich in resources that people didn't have to spend all their time trying to find food, essentially. And so that gave them time to further develop their religion and their art and their, the way that they did things, their society. Those resources included close proximity to all kinds of game for hunting and proximity to the ocean, which those tribes plied frequently in really big, long boats going out on fishing expeditions and even hunting otters and seals and whales. As you go south into California, right there on the northern border, you had a lot of tribes who were similar to that Pacific Northwest. But there's a lot of variety within what is the modern-day state of California. In fact, take a look at all the different tribal territories that existed before contact, dozens of them. In fact, there are as many and possibly more tribes in California than in the whole rest of the American Southwest. And that too is because of the availability of the resources. At least that's my theory. If you go just a little bit farther to the east, in what are today the states of Nevada and Arizona, you will find huge areas of those states, those modern-day states, were controlled by maybe one tribe, different bands of one or two tribes. Yet you get into California and there's all these different ones. I think that's because the abundance of resources meant that there wasn't as much competition, so it was less likely that one group would gather themselves together and chase out somebody else, because there was pretty much enough to go around. Until you get farther south into Southern California, you'll notice that the tribal territories are larger, but there's still several of them. Now, one significant thing about the California tribes is that they did not have corn, which was the staple for all the other tribes, essentially, unless you get up into the subarctic, Arctic and subarctic. Instead, in most of California, especially northern California, instead of corn, it was acorns. There were so many acorns, there were so many trees that the forest floors were just full of them, and large populations were sustained by people just going out and gathering together all those acorns, which they would pound up and make into a type of flour like cornmeal, but it's acorn meal, and used to cook with. So another thing that's distinctive about California tribes, Southern California tribes, actually this extended up into Central California, is that there was a lot of cultural, religious use of hallucinogenic things like peyote in the South, in Southern California and over into Arizona and Nevada. A little bit farther north, Jimson weed, that can be made into a tea that can really get your attention. So I like to say that between that and the fishing expeditions, Southern California, it was still doing drugs on the beach to a large extent. Anyway, this held true until the 1700s, the late 1700s, when the Spanish finally started to make their presence strongly felt in California. Now, California was part of New Spain. That was basically all of South America except for Brazil and a couple of other small places, and all of Central America, all the way up into the American Southwest, and California, right? So the Spanish had control of that by the late 1700s for almost 300 years. So why weren't they in California? Because California was the northernmost part of New Spain, and it was pretty far flung. It was a difficult logistical thing, for one thing, to supply settlements that far away from Mexico City. And there was kind of a general feeling that there's nothing up there anyway but a bunch of trees, so who cares? Didn't really seem to have anything else of value. So therefore, it wasn't until the late 1700s the Spanish started moving in numbers, and when they did, they started establishing missions, which is why so many cities in California that started off as Spanish villages, Mexican, well, first Spanish, then became Mexico around 1821 or so, 1820. Or was it 1819? Circa 1820. The reason so many California towns start with San or Santa, right? Like San Diego. San is the masculine form of saint. Santa is the feminine form of saint. So San Diego is St. James. Santa Barbara, St. Barbara. Why did it take them so long to get there? I'm actually going to hold off on that, and I'll tell you about that in a little bit when we get to actually another section here in a minute. But those missions were, there was a church in the middle of it. There were soldiers that were sent along with missionaries, and the local tribes were essentially forced to live on the missions and do the work there. And in return, they were protected from other Indians was the promise. But essentially, it was virtual slavery for those tribes, and many of those tribes rebelled. Many of them fought back. It was actually things are going to get a whole lot worse for them in a few decades when the Americans, the Norte Americanos, show up. But In Southern California, once the Spanish had made their presence finally known by the early 1800s, there was a cattle industry in Southern California. There were some large cattle ranches, haciendas, that weren't really cattle ranches in the sense we think of in the Old West, where they were driven to market to be slaughtered and made into beef. Actually, the logistics of that would have been difficult in the early 1800s. It was more for their hides and tallow, because it was used in oils, lamp oil, and to make candles and stuff, which pre-electricity there was a lot of demand for. So a lot of the Spanish, the Hispanic, Mexican, eventually, a lot of the Latino folks who worked on these ranches established some practices and some approaches that would be long lasting and would make an impact on U.S. culture eventually, because the ways of working on these cattle ranches and the things they learned would spread along the border to the Latino ranches in Texas, so that when the Anglos in Texas were starting to get into the cattle industry, they frequently employed Hispanic cowboys, which that's something that most folks don't know. In the Old West, somewhere between 20 to 25% of working cowboys were Latino, and between 20 to 25% were African American. You don't really see that reflected in the Westerns as much. But here are some parts of cattle culture that had a Spanish origin, either in California along the border or in Texas, but largely in California. Spanish word for cow is vaca. So someone who works with cows, a cowboy, was called a vaquero. So once the Anglos came to California, they had an unfortunate tendency to not be able to pronounce Spanish words and sort of gave their own spin to them. So vaquero became vaquero, buckaroo. Hey there, buckaroo. Increasingly, when I say that, students have never even heard the word before. Nobody watches the old Westerns anymore. But take my word for it, or if not, just listen for it. Buckaroo for a cowboy. A braided rope was called a reata, and that's a feminine word, so it's la reata, which became lariat in English. The word for dungeon, calabozo, was used sort of as a term for the jail, and in English to English cowboys, that became calaboose. Watch out there, buckaroo. You'll wind up in a calaboose. A noose, not necessarily a noose for hanging people, but any kind of noose, was called a lasso or lasso. So those terms made their way, like I said, through the vaqueros to the American cowboy, eventually to Hollywood. All right, well, we're still talking about the Pacific Northwest and even Northern California, but we're going to move away from the Spanish focus. We're going to look at Russian America, which that's usually not one of the colonial powers people think of, but they were one, at least to an extent. The Russians first discovered Alaska, and by discovered, I mean as Europeans figured out it was there. There were plenty of native people living there already who had discovered it probably 20,000 years earlier. Anyway, the Russians found their way to Alaska, I think in the 1600s. Didn't really make a lot of efforts to try to settle in Alaska. They did send some missionaries, though, Russian Orthodox missionaries. However, by the late 1700s, the Russians were getting in on the fur trade along the coast of the Pacific northwest. And especially the sea otter trade, which provided pelts that could be used to make felt similar to how beavers could, and was extremely lucrative. Now, remember when I said that the Spanish didn't really start doing anything in California, even though they had, technically been in control of it for 200 or 300 years until the late 1700s? That's because the Russians were coming. The Russians were setting up trading posts and forts along the Pacific coast and interacting and trading with local native peoples, and in some cases abusing them and forcing them into servitude. And so the Spanish officials operating out of New Spain, out of the capital in Mexico City, realized that, hey, if we don't get some settlements up there, it'll get snatched out from under us. And so that's why they started building all those missions all of a sudden after having no interest for a couple hundred years. Well, by the way, the picture there in the lower right, that is a bidarka. That is a two-person kayak. Kayak, of course, was something that was invented by the native peoples of the Arctic and subarctic region. I said that the Russians were proceeding southward down the Pacific coast. They got as far as near modern-day San Francisco. 1812, they built a fort there called Fort Ross. And that was the high point of their expansion, because the otter trade started to dry up, and it was no longer, economically to their best advantage to keep going southward to try to maintain these forts. Eventually, they just kind of retracted backward. They couldn't import things from Russia because it was too far away. They weren't able to grow a lot of stuff in Alaska and the subarctic region. Plus, even the area over in Russia across the Bering Strait, Kamchatka, that was really a frontier itself. So for all those reasons, the Russians just kind of lost interest in California. And so they pulled out around 1840. Then, as we previously mentioned, the U.S.-Mexican War happened. Started in 1846, ended in 1848, with the United States taking over most of the American Southwest from the Spanish. Now, at the very beginning, in California, there were a small number of Anglos, of Norte Americanos, U.S. citizens, living in California. There weren't a whole lot of them, but there were some. In fact, there weren't a whole lot of anybody other than Native Americans in California at this time. So when the war with Mexico started and the U.S. Army was advancing toward California, a group of those Anglo settlers kind of got together and overthrew the Mexican leadership of California before the U.S. Army got there, and declared themselves an independent country and made their own flag, the California Republic there with the bear, so that the bear has been closely associated with California on their state flag now. A grand 3-week and 1-day experience as an independent country until the U.S. Army got there, at which point they turned it over. So now the U.S. is in control of California as of 1848. And then, in late 1848, at a place called Sutter's Mill, John Sutter, or Jan Sutter, he was a Swiss immigrant, operated a mill there and discovered gold. there in Northern California near the American River, so that all of a sudden there was a gold rush and people came pouring in from all over the country and from all over the world. Now, this was bad news for the Russians, because remember, they had pulled out just a few years earlier than this because they thought it was worthless, and then when they leave, the U.S. gets it and discovered gold. Later on, about 15 years later, the Russians decide to sell Alaska, and the U.S. buys it for fairly cheap, although most Americans thought it was a stupid idea because it's just a bunch of ice, which is what the Russians thought too. But once the Russians were gone and the Americans took over, they discovered gold there too, and there was another gold rush. Anyway, when there's a gold rush, lots of people show up. Now, in 1847, the non-Indian population of California was about 15,000. By 1854, that had grown to over 300,000. In the little mission village of San Francisco, small town of San Francisco, 1847, there were 500 people. By 1870, there were 150,000 people there. It was one of the biggest cities in the United States. In fact, so many people came in so quickly that within a year they had enough people to apply for statehood, which has a population threshold to try to do. This was very bad news for the native people, by the way, because of the disease that was brought by these non-Indians to which the native people were susceptible. Also the fact that these miners that were pouring in, there was little or no organized law enforcement, and so the raping of Native American women was just unbelievable in its scope, and the actual genocide or attempted genocide of native tribes, in which once the state was established and there was law, bounties were offered for the scalps of Native Americans, men, women, and children, with the intention of eradicating them. So that was rough on them. Someone else that things became rough on were one particular immigrant group. Now, there were immigrants from all over the place coming trying to get rich in the gold fields. There also were a lot of Chinese immigrants. Now, why were there Chinese immigrants? At first, because they wanted to get rich in the gold fields. In 1849, there were 54 Chinese people in California. In 1876, there were 116,000 out of 154,000 in the U.S. So 116 out of the 154,000 were in California. From the beginning, the Chinese were singled out for terrible treatment, for prejudice. They were often easy targets because no one came to their defense and no one really did anything if crimes were committed against them. 1852, the state created the foreign miners tax that initially was $3 a month, but eventually was $20 a month. $30 a month was the average salary for a person at that time. So you can see that's pretty expensive. Technically, all foreigners, non-U.S. citizens, but guess who that got enforced on, and guess who it didn't. It was enforced on the Chinese, tried to get them to leave by making life hard on them. Eventually, 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first legislation specifically barring people from entering the U.S. and becoming citizens solely based on where they were from and what their race was. you can find lots of examples of cartoons from that time, newspaper cartoons that were pretty vicious about Chinese people. They were called various racially charged names. Celestials was one, because one of the names for China by its people was the Celestial Kingdom or Heavenly Kingdom, but that was used sarcastically by non-Chinese people against them in the United States. Also, during this time period, this was during the time of the Qing dynasty. That's how you pronounce that Q, by the way, in Pinyin transliteration of Chinese, the Qing dynasty. And that may be, these people came from the land of the Qing. That may be where a particular racial epithet that sounds a lot like Qing came from. So here are some Chinese miners. Chinese miners were frequently attacked by bands of outlaws. If they fought back, it would bring down the ire of the community if they killed white people. And then if they were killed or robbed, no one did anything about it. All right, so that's the situation socially. Let's take a look at the first thing we'll look at, the mining practices, the simplest and most common way of looking at the impact that they had on the environment there was placer mining. Now that looks like it should be pronounced placer, but it's placer. It comes from the same root word as the Spanish word plaza, which basically essentially means out in the open, an open place. So placer mining is mining out in the open. It's not really mining at all, actually, but it's out in the open, sifting through the alluvial deposits, either in rivers and streams or places where rivers and streams used to be and had dried up. So you sift through the soil, essentially, in the riverbed, and you do it in a pan. So panning for gold. This is the stereotypical means of looking for gold for the typical San Francisco 49er, which, if you didn't know, is where that term comes from. People who came into San Francisco in 1849 to look for gold. So gold is a heavy metal, all right? And gold is usually located in the mountains. However, these rivers and streams that came flowing down from the mountains and had been flowing down for hundreds of thousands or millions of years had often carried bits of gold off the mountain down into the areas where there were rivers and streams, and that those nuggets of gold, or sometimes just flecks of gold, were just sort of buried in the wet soil of the riverbed. Because gold is heavy, you could take a pan full of water and silt and just kind of slosh it around and slosh the stuff out. The gold is going to be on the bottom because it's so heavy, and that's why that works. However, that's a pretty rudimentary way to go about it, and it takes a whole lot of time to build up any significant amount of gold. So people started applying that same principle, but a little bit differently. Sluice mining. That carries the same basic principle of panning for gold, but what you do is you've got a sluice. You've got this sort of it looks kind of like an aluminum ladder with a bottom like a bed on it, or like a conveyor or something. It's got kind of the sort of rough bumps inside, and it's kind of like this little like a little flue, not a little flue, like a big flue that you set up so that the water runs through it, and as the water runs over those bumps in the bottom of it, that catches those ridges. It catches the gold So that's using the power of the flowing water rather than standing there with a pan. Now, eventually, they started getting more creative and trying to get more quickly at the source of the gold. River mining. Now, it sounds like what we just talked about would be called a river mining because you wade out in the river with a pan. But essentially what river mining was diverting the river by getting out there, a bunch of folks getting out there and digging a trench that's going to send the river off in another direction. And then you don't have to deal with the water anymore because now you've got the river bed with all that gold in there that you can now just kind of poke through in an even more convenient way. All right, well, things got more creative. Hydraulic mining it was being used by the late 1850s. It was essentially using that river water in high pressure hoses, really, really high pressure hoses, directed at the side of mountains. So this blasting, essentially, with water was so powerful that it just broke apart the face of the mountain and stripped away all the soil so that the veins of gold inside the mountain would then become visible and accessible. Now this is pretty effective for getting at the actual, deposits, the veins of gold. But it was problematic because, well, for one thing, you're destroying all these mountains. That's problematic in itself. But for another thing, as you're knocking all of these rocks and all this soil off the side of the mountain, where does it go? Well, it comes tumbling down. Now, by the way, here is that same mountain in the previous photograph about 150 years later, still scarred, still deeply scarred by that hydraulic mining. But, as I was saying, where does it all go? It gets washed down the river, right? You get a whole bunch of rocks and soil getting washed down the river. What's going to happen? It's going to dam up that river. And what happens when the rivers get dammed up like that? Eventually, that floating debris is going to cause massive flooding. The town of Marysville was completely submerged in a flood that ultimately was caused by all the debris from the hydraulic mining. Congress passed a law banning hydraulic mining in 1884. Now, if you want to look at the history of environmental regulation, most people don't go as far back as 1884. It sounds almost unheard of. But that is how serious the issue was. All right. Hard rock mining, that's what people usually associate with mines in general. That is where basically you just carve tunnels into the side of the mountain where the gold is. And you make sure, kind of similar to how they get coal, you make sure that there are wooden beams to prop up the roof so the mountain doesn't fall on you. And you get in there with picks and drills and stuff, and you just literally just dig the gold out of the side of the walls. Even then, that may seem like on the surface, you can't really see anything on the surface because it's all under the surface. But there were some unexpected problems with that as well. They would dig out the gold, and usually it's not just like pure gold there waiting for you. It's mixed in. It's mixed in with other elements and minerals and rock and dirt. It's ore. It's ore, and in that ore is some gold. How do you get it out? Well, what they would do is they would mix that ore with mercury or quicksilver. And they would then subject it to intense heat. And what they had discovered was that under intense heat, mercury bonds with that mercury bonds with gold. And under intense heat, you burn away everything else. You've got the amalgamation of mercury and gold. And when the heat is hot enough, that mercury will evaporate, leaving only the pure gold. So that's a way, a roundabout way to get at the pure gold. But there's a problem. Things that evaporate don't necessarily stay evaporated. Even if they did, they're in the air. Mercury in high concentration is very dangerous. It can cause insanity and then death. You ever heard the expression mad as a hatter? Or, in Alice in Wonderland, the Mad Hatter. People who made hats in the 1800s, they noticed they went crazy a lot. Eventually they figured out it's because they used mercury in their hat making. Anyway, problem here is that mercury would evaporate and then, would reform condensation and become a part of the water table. So these are areas, they're the areas that are in sort of the beige color through California that today still have dangerously high concentrations of mercury. So this was, it started almost 200 years ago, 170 years ago, but it continued. They continued using mercury in this way for a very long time, and it has been, like I said, very problematic. One other thing that definitely needs mentioning when discussing the West Coast and the arrival of settlers in that area is the salmon industry. Now, the Native American tribes, as I mentioned, had sustained themselves on fishing as well as on hunting for generations, for centuries, and they used a variety of different methods. They used spears, they used nets, they used traps set along the river, primarily the Columbia River in Washington and its tributaries is what we're talking about. And once that settlers started coming into the Oregon Territory and it was further divided into Oregon and Washington, in the 1860s, the salmon fishery business took off in those areas, in large part due to some advances in canning technology that enabled them to can a lot of things more quickly. So several different competing companies, a bunch of different fisheries, went into business and used whatever methods they could to get as many fish as they could. They were sometimes, the salmon, referred to as pink gold because it became a very popular thing as new markets were explored and opened up, and people around the country and even around the world developed a taste for these particular fish. So one of the ways that these businesses operated was the use of nets, wheel nets in particular, that essentially would be set out into the river and would catch virtually all the fish as they were swimming along. And then an alternate method was up there in the upper right. It's called a wheel trap. It's kind of like a Ferris wheel. It's a little series of buckets that's set at a point along the river where the salmon are going to have to swim through, particularly as they are going to their breeding ground, when large numbers of them are coming through. And so the buckets just scoop them up like clockwork. Scoop them up, dump them, scoop them up, dump them. And both of those methods were able to catch a whole lot more fish than a guy with a fishing pole would be able to, or a guy with a spear. And the resources, the number of fish seemed limitless. This is a familiar story by now, right? And so more and more of them were being harvested, not using the traditional methods of the Indians of the area, who, even though they also used nets and different kinds of traps, were very, very observant and had been over generations as to when the ideal times were to catch the amount of fish they needed and when to stop catching fish and how many to let through, to let go, so that they could spawn, lay their eggs, and make sure there were more fish later. These businesses weren't doing that. And the competition was really fierce by the 1880s into the 1890s. Sometimes, as the different companies were trying to get monopolies along the Columbia River, they would have skirmishes. Sometimes shootings and killings would occur as they were trying to put one another out of business. And it seemed as though by the late 1890s they were going to put everybody out of business, because the harvest of fish was getting so much smaller because they were overfishing. And so Washington and Oregon stepped in, the legislature stepped in and started passing regulations, started passing laws limiting the number of fish that could be taken and the way by which they could be taken. That's the main thing that they did, is that they outlawed both the wheel nets and the wheel traps, so as to make it a little bit harder and therefore let some of the fish actually get by, so there would continue being fish. Now, they're still in competition to some degree with the local Indian tribes, and we'll talk about this later when we talk about how all this stuff affects Native Americans. But those state laws that get passed, there's going to be a big question as to whether that applies to Indians who are doing these things that are now all of a sudden against the rules. And another issue that started to arise in the early 20th century was the building of hydroelectric dams along the Columbia River, in particular the Columbia River Basin. There were several. There was the Grand Coulee Dam. There was the Bonneville Dam. Around 1920, that thing was built, and there was no access way built into it for the salmon to get through the dam to continue their trip to their spawning grounds. The chief engineer of the dam said, "We do not intend to play nursemaid to the fish." However, they were endangering the fish as a species, and they were also endangering the industry that had grown up around them. And endangering industry is something that, especially in the early 20th century, would get people's attention a lot more than endangering species would. So they had to make some changes to that dam so that the salmon would be allowed to come through. Now, like I said, we'll be talking a lot more about these fishing issues when we talk about Native Americans. But now, let's consider ourselves as having wrapped up our brief survey of the settlers and the Indians in the frontier on the West Coast, and now let's turn our attention to the interior.